no music. A gym mat, a rolled-up foam mat in a high school gym, and inside it, a body. January 2013, Valdosta High School. 17-year-old Kendrick Johnson found upside down in a mat, a shoe nearby, a community stunned. How does a healthy teenager end up like that? And why, years later, are so many questions still unanswered? This is Still Unanswered. I'm Maya Ellison. Welcome back. Or, if this is your first episode, welcome. Still Unanswered is a show about cases where official explanations leave real gaps, where the record, the evidence, or the people left behind demand we keep asking. Today, we're beginning a close look at the death of Kendrick Johnson. This episode is not a sensational retelling, it's a careful reconstruction. We'll walk the timeline, examine what investigators said, listen to the family's doubts, and bring in an independent expert to explain the medical questions that make this case so contested. A quick note. This episode deals with a death and with the consequences of grief and distrust. We'll be deliberate with language marking what is confirmed, what is disputed, and what remains unknown. Our aim is to honor the family's loss while holding to facts. We also want to remind listeners, if you have credible first-hand information about this case, contact investigators or established civil rights organizations. Don't just post unverified claims on social media. Okay, let's start where the world started, where Kendrick's family's world suddenly stopped. Who was Kendrick? Kendrick Johnson was 17 years old. His family described him as a son, a brother, a student, interested in sports, enlisted in the life of his high school, someone friends considered athletic and capable. That matters. Whether a person is physically able to perform an action, whether they climb, jump, squeeze into a space, shapes how plausible certain scenarios are. So when the official explanation described Kendrick accidentally getting trapped in a rolled mat, his family pushed back. They said, "That doesn't sound like our son." Let me be clear. Humanizing Kendrick isn't a rhetorical device. It's central. Policies, procedures, autopsy reports, those are important. But so is remembering the person whose life is at the center. For the Johnson family, the unanswered questions are not an abstract puzzle. They're the difference between closure and a continuing wound. All right. Now, the day everything changed. This is the sequence as it's commonly reported. On the afternoon of January 11, 2013, Kendrick was at Valdosta High School. He was seen in the gym area. He didn't return home that evening. His parents reported him missing. The next morning, January 12, school staff responded to calls and opened a rolled-up gym mat in the wrestling area. Inside was Kendrick, upside down. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Those are the basic, widely agreed-on facts. But beneath that straightforward timeline, there are a number of inconsistencies and gaps that we need to parse carefully. When the mat was unrolled, school staff and first responders described a scene that, officially, had no obvious signs of a struggle. Authorities quickly began investigating, and the initial state medical examiner classified the death as accidental positional asphyxia. The theory, in plain terms, was that Kendrick had fallen into the mat, likely reaching for a shoe, became trapped nose down, and suffocated. That's the official story that set the baseline. Now, the baseline was immediately contested. The Johnson family, and many people who looked at the photographs, the videos, and the autopsy reports, found the accidental death explanation hard to accept. They noted Kendrick's athleticism and questioned whether he could have gotten into that position by himself. They pointed to injuries and bruising they believed were inconsistent with a simple accident. They wanted a fuller accounting. They sought independent medical review. And this is where the case turned into a national controversy.
Maya, if I can jump in, this is Aaron. I want to pause for a moment on the term positional asphyxia, because it's central to understanding the official cause and also central to the disputes that followed. Positional asphyxia is not a single neat diagnosis like gunshot wound. It's a mechanism, meaning it describes how death occurred. The person's position prevented effective breathing. That can arise from someone being face down, or chest compressed, or airway obstructed by position. But, and this is important, the medical conclusions about positional asphyxia depend heavily on context. Scene findings, witness statements, autopsy results, and the absence or presence of other injuries or toxicology findings. There's often a lot of interpretive room.
Aaron, thank you. We'll dig deeper into the medical questions in a bit. First, the family's perspective and why they refused to let this go. The Johnsons said that the shoe found, allegedly, in the mat didn't match what they recognized. They talked about marks on Kendrick's body that the family believed suggested he had been forced or assaulted. They asked, if surveillance cameras existed in the halls and gym, why was there so much ambiguity about what they showed? And they asked for more than one autopsy. Those requests set off a chain of legal and investigative actions: exhumation, independent autopsies, civil suits, federal inquiries, lots of media attention. Let's pause and follow the thread of autopsies and exhumation, because that became a flashpoint. After the state's initial autopsy ruled the death accidental, the family hired independent pathologists. Those examinations reached different conclusions. The independent review raised the possibility of non-accidental trauma, pointing to injuries the family said were inconsistent with the state's finding. The disagreement escalated when reports surfaced claiming that organs had been removed and replaced with newspaper in the body cavity. That claim was explosive.
Maya, again, Aaron, let me step in on that because it's one of the most misunderstood parts. When bodies are prepared for burial after an autopsy, organs may be returned to the body cavity. Different medical examiners have different protocols. Some place organs back in, wrapped, others preserve them. Claims about newspaper being used as filler are serious, but also require careful verification. Newspaper is not a standard preservative or packing material in professional autopsy practice. So when that allegation emerged, it became important to look at chain of custody documents, autopsy photographs, and the records of the county medical examiner's office. The problem is, those records can be incomplete in the public file, and that absence feeds suspicion.
Right. And that absence, plus the independent autopsy's contrasting findings, moved this case from a local tragedy to national attention. Let's return to the surveillance footage, because that's often where people looked for clarity, and where clarity was thin. Video from the school, as released by authorities, showed some movement in the gym area around the time Kendrick went missing. But the footage, as released, had limitations: angles that missed critical sight lines, periods of missing time, and quality so grainy that identifying individuals with certainty was difficult. The family and their supporters argued the footage showed people moving a mat or behaving suspiciously, while school officials and investigators said the footage did not indicate foul play or provide conclusive evidence of third-party involvement. Aaron, from a forensic standpoint, how much can we reasonably expect surveillance video to tell us in a case like this?
Good question. Surveillance video is a tool, but it's not omniscient. It depends on camera placement, resolution, frame rate, and, crucially, the continuity of footage. A camera may cover a hallway but not the interior of the gym, or it might have blind spots. In many older school systems, cameras were installed for safety, but not with forensic-grade continuity or resolution. So the footage might show general activity, students walking, mats being moved, but miss decisive seconds. Also, when people refer to missing time in a video, that can be due to camera repositioning, a camera going offline, or even normal frame drops. That doesn't mean evidence was intentionally removed, but I want to be honest. Missing or low-quality footage leaves room for multiple interpretations, and in emotionally charged cases, that gap becomes a focal point for mistrust.
And that mistrust is the engine of the next section: investigations, lawsuits, and changing narratives. The local sheriff's office conducted the primary investigation and ultimately supported the accidental death ruling. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Middle District of Georgia opened a federal investigation at one point, largely to determine whether civil rights violations had occurred or whether federal laws had been broken. After review, the federal investigators closed their inquiry without charging anyone criminally. The family, unconvinced, filed civil lawsuits, naming school officials, some law enforcement personnel, and others, alleging negligence in investigation, and, in some filings, more serious accusations. Some of those civil suits were dismissed, some were settled, others were withdrawn. The legal path was long, expensive, and produced both public hearings and closed-door filings. Aaron, how does a case like this wind up with conflicting legal outcomes? I mean, no criminal charges, civil suits, exhumations. How do the legal and medical sides interact in producing those different results?
Two main points: standard of proof and scope of inquiry. Criminal investigations require proof beyond a reasonable doubt to charge and convict. If the physical evidence is ambiguous, no DNA linking a third party to a crime scene, no definitive wound showing trauma consistent with assault, then prosecutors may decline charges. Civil suits operate under a lower standard: preponderance of the evidence. That's one reason families pursue civil litigation even when no criminal case moves forward. On the medical side, different pathologists may interpret injuries differently. For example, bruising can be caused by blunt force trauma, but it can also result from CPR, resuscitation efforts, or post-mortem handling. Time-sense injury, decomposition, and embalming can obscure details. So you have legal systems asking medical experts to provide answers that medicine sometimes can't deliver with absolute certainty.
That's so important to hear. Different processes, different burdens of proof, different evidentiary thresholds. And for the Johnson family, all of that meant years of activism and public statements insisting the truth hadn't been reached. Which brings us to how the media and public discourse shaped the case. National outlets picked up the story, understandably, because here was a young black man found dead under unusual circumstances, a family in conflict with local authorities, and claims of missing organs and possible cover-ups. Social media amplified theories, some reasonable, some speculative, some demonstrably false. And that dynamic created pressure on institutions, but also confusion over what was verified and what was rumor. Aaron, in your experience, how does public scrutiny affect forensic work and investigations?
Public scrutiny can have both constructive and detrimental effects. On the positive side, it can draw attention to overlooked leads, prod agencies to be more transparent, and push for the involvement of independent experts. On the negative side, it can create pressure to produce quick answers, discourage cooperation from witnesses afraid of harassment, or seed public misunderstanding when preliminary findings are interpreted as final. Forensic science benefits from thoroughness and time. When the court of public opinion demands immediate verdicts, you risk conflating suspicion with proof. Still, serious public scrutiny can be a necessary corrective if agencies are not forthcoming.
Right. Let's take stock. At this point in the episode, I want to clearly separate what we know from what is disputed and what probably will never be fully answered without new, credible evidence. First, what is broadly agreed on? Number 1. Kendrick Johnson attended Valdosta High School and was last seen there on January 11, 2013. Number 2. His body was discovered on January 12 inside a rolled-up gym mat in the wrestling area. Number 3. The state medical examiner initially ruled the death accidental, positional asphyxia. Number 4. The family disagreed and sought independent review, resulting in exhumation and additional autopsies that produced conflicting conclusions. Second, what is actively disputed? Cause of death, whether it was an accident or involved third-party actions, the interpretation of injuries and bruising, whether they indicate non-accidental trauma or could be explained by resuscitation and postmortem handling, the presence and handling of organs, specifically allegations about organs being missing or replaced with filler material in the body cavity, the completeness and implications of surveillance footage, missing time, ambiguous angles, and whether footage was adequately preserved. Third, what may never be fully answered unless new, credible evidence emerges? Who, if anyone, might have been responsible if it was not an accident? Precise sequence of events in the gym during the window of disappearance, and ultimate reconciliation of conflicting medical interpretations if the raw evidence needed for resolution is degraded or absent.
Maya, I want to underline one more medical nuance here. Cause of death and manner of death are distinct. Cause is the immediate mechanism, positional asphyxia. Manner is the category, natural, accident, suicide, homicide, undetermined. Pathologists can agree on a cause but differ on manner because manner requires interpretation of intent and context. In Kendrick's case, the cause, if recorded as asphyxia, was one part. Deciding if that asphyxia was the result of an accident or of actions by others moves into circumstantial territory that requires corroborating evidence beyond autopsy alone. That's why we're seeing such divergence among experts.
Thank you, Aaron. I want to take a moment to bring this back to the human cost, because it's easy, especially in forensic debates, to lose sight of who's living with the consequences. The Johnson family has spent years grieving, litigating, and advocating. Grief is private, also public when families choose to go to court or to the press. They've said publicly that they won't rest until they know the truth. That pursuit itself exacts a heavy toll. Legal costs, media exposure, the strain of repeatedly retelling trauma. The local community also suffered. Questions about school safety, about how students are supervised, about trust in law enforcement. This isn't an abstract policy problem. It's very personal. Before we move toward closing, Aaron, there are a few specific technical points I want you to unpack for listeners who may not have medical backgrounds. The significance of bruising patterns, how embalming and exhumation can change a body, and why different pathologists might disagree on the meaning of injuries.
Sure. First, bruising patterns. Bruises are the result of blood vessels rupturing beneath the skin. Their shape can sometimes tell you about the instrument used. Linear bruises could suggest a rod, circular could indicate forceps. But often, bruises are nonspecific. Their color can give an estimate of age, but that's imprecise and affected by skin tone and individual factors. Second, embalming, burial, and exhumation. After death, decomposition begins. Embalming delays decomposition but alters tissues. When a body is exhumed, the embalming, decomposition, and interment process can make it harder to interpret soft tissue injuries. Third, disagreements among pathologists. They're interpreting a damaged and altered set of tissues and trying to reconstruct events. When records are incomplete, and when injuries could be explained by multiple mechanisms, like a bruise from falling versus being grabbed, reasonable professionals can reach different conclusions. That's why documentation, photographs, and chain of custody are critical.
That chain of custody point, I'll note it again because it shows up as a recurring theme in this case. Where evidence isn't clearly accounted for, public trust erodes. And when trust erodes, narratives rush in to fill the gaps. That rush is what we've seen in media coverage and online speculation. So why does this case still matter? A few reasons. One, it shows how the absence of clear answers leaves communities vulnerable to mistrust. Two, it highlights the limits of forensic certainty and how different systems, criminal, civil, medical, interact imperfectly. Three, it raises broader questions about transparency in school incidents and how families are informed when tragedy strikes. And four, Kendrick's story is one instance in a larger pattern where families, often Black families, question whether institutions have done everything to find the truth. I want to be very careful here. I am not saying institutional failure is proven in every such case. What I am saying is that when questions pile up, missing footage, conflicting autopsies, contested evidence, the system should have clear, demonstrable explanations. When it doesn't, people's skepticism is not irrational. It's a rational response to uncertainty.
And Maya, to add, this case is an example of why standardized protocols matter. Clear documentation of autopsies, consistent retention of tissue samples, high-quality video preservation policies in public facilities, these are not glamorous reforms, but they build the foundation for credible investigations. In the absence of such protocols, even well-meaning investigators can leave gaps that are exploited by poor inferences or misinterpretations.
Let's speak directly to listeners for a moment. If you're hearing this and you feel a pull to get involved, first, pause. Consider the source of your information. Credible information means first-hand knowledge, documentation, or official records. Second, if you do have first-hand information relevant to this case, contact law enforcement agencies who are authorized to receive tips or established civil rights organizations that can help shepherd information responsibly. Third, engage ethically. Avoid amplifying unverified claims that could harm families or interfere with investigations. One more thing. This show is called Still Unanswered because we believe questions should be kept alive when the record is incomplete, not to court conspiracy, but to insist on clarity when lives are at stake. The Johnson family has asked for answers. So have other families in cases with disputed conclusions. Their insistence is part of how democratic institutions are held to account. Before we close, Aaron, what would you tell a listener who wants to understand more about forensic disagreement without falling into cynicism?
I'd say hold two ideas at once. One, science and forensics are powerful tools that can explain crimes and produce justice. Two, they're not magic. They rely on evidence, which can be lost, contaminated, or ambiguous. Healthy skepticism matters, and so does humility. Accept that medical and legal professionals can, at times, differ in good faith. but also insist on transparency. Documented records, preserved samples, clear chain of custody. Those are the building blocks of trust.
Thank you, Aaron. We're going to end this episode where we began, with the image of a rolled mat and a family that refuses to let this rest. Kendrick Johnson's death is, in many ways, still unanswered, and that's the point. Not to keep a wound open for its own sake, but to insist that unanswered questions require more scrutiny, more transparency, and, where possible, more evidence. If you found this episode meaningful, consider subscribing to Still Unanswered. If you have verified, credible information about this case, please reach out. Contact details are in the episode notes and on our website. We do not publish unverified tips. We work carefully with credible sources and with organizations that can help if new information emerges. In our next episode, if we continue this as a mini-series, we'll bring in additional experts. A second independent forensic pathologist who reviewed the autopsy material, a legal analyst who can walk us through the civil filings in more detail, and we'll attempt to reconstruct the video's chain of custody with a digital forensics expert. We'll look at specific photographs and documents where possible, and we'll continue to separate the substantiated from the speculative. For now, I want to close with this. Unresolved deaths are not just forensic puzzles or media spectacles. They are lives cut short and families left with the work of remembering and of demanding accountability. We owe them care in our reporting, and we owe them a commitment to truth-seeking, even when truth is hard to find. This is Maya Ellison for Still Unanswered. Thank you for listening.